This paper discusses the importance of embedding intersectionality into participatory methods to address climate justice and proposes a methodology based on storytelling, arts, and performative approaches to negotiate the principles underpinning a just climate transition. The world has warmed 1.1 degrees Celsius, and the extent of climate change impacts are larger than estimated previously, with half of the world's population living in contexts that are highly vulnerable to climate change. The scientific community acknowledges that the impact of climate change is and will be increasingly unequal, depending on a number of intersecting factors. And there is a recognition of how people's identities across different axes, such as gender, race, class, age, ability, sexuality, citizenship, religion, etc., determine how people are affected by climate change, because these identities shape people's geography, livelihood, vulnerability, and capacity to adapt. Scholars agree that those who have exacerbated climate change least are those who are and will suffer the most over the coming decades. Such climate injustice is historically and spatially produced and disproportionately affects women, poor and racialized people in the global south, and also marginalized minorities in the global north. There is evidence that policies and interventions to deal with climate change may further increase inequalities and injustice, largely because they are blind to intersectional inequalities, ignore the complex layers of vulnerability, and lack the participation of the affected stakeholders in designing solutions. And scholars are pushing for a diversity of voices in climate policymaking and for a justice perspective that takes into account the different and multiple layers of intersecting inequalities. And intersectionality is the most effective approach that has emerged in the social sciences to analyze issues of structural inequalities and injustice. It recognizes the unique subjective experience of multiple forms of oppression that individuals and groups face and that are shaped by their simultaneous identities across multiple axes of differences. Different aspects of individual and collective social identities play a crucial role in social processes, shaping life's chances. The relationship between these identities are intertwined with power, and these unequal relations between identities contribute to intersectional inequalities. However, these identities and relationships between them are socially constructed, and thus they can be socially deconstructed and transformed. Climate change intersectional inequalities include 4 dimensions that are experienced in intersectional ways. Different contribution to causing climate change, different vulnerabilities leading to unequal impacts of climate change itself and of climate change responses, unequal contribution to climate change adaptation and mitigation, and unequal opportunities to be involved in climate change decision-making. An intersectional participatory approach can reveal how these intersectional inequalities interact with climate change and policy to address it, transforming power relations that are at the core of social identities and so leading to a more just, democratic, and multifaceted and multi-scalar climate solutions. As climate activists have argued, and scholars now fully recognize, the climate crisis is not about the environment, but it is a crisis of human rights and justice. This is created and driven by colonial, racist, patriarchal systems of oppression. And it is these oppressive systems that intersectionality is best placed to recognize. And this recognition is a precondition for starting to dismantle them. For example, grassroots climate movements argue that fossil fuel extraction is an industry built on exploitation and on globalized racism. The harm is offshore from rich countries to poorer ones, while the demand is driven by the rich. In this context, there is need for new climate knowledge to counter the disempowering techno-scientific system dominating climate change policy. There is a need to place plural ways of knowing around the world, including subalternal knowledge, at the center of climate knowledge. This involves co-production that challenges and debates the norms, values, and assumptions underpinning climate knowledge. A growing number of scholars are now calling for a change towards transformation in climate scholarship and for adaptation to be seen as a social process to change systems and structures. And Callaghan and others, for example, they suggest a need for more social science with a focus on climate solution. However, the focus on solution is often linked to a reductionist approach that squeezes research into simple messages and clear numbers, obscuring the importance of stories that could help to understand the complexity of the issue. And to counter these shortcomings, various scholars argue for epistemological diversity in climate change research, to challenge the separation of nature from society, which impairs our capacity to imagine other futures, and is founded on the false premise that climatic drivers of climate change are separate from social ones. Intersectional research enables the study of groups of people through multiple dimensions of individual and collective identities and examination of the system that dominates and oppresses them, thus allowing one to comprehend the co-production of injustices structurally, materially, and discursively. And in his critical environmental justice approach, Pello argues that racism, heteropatriarchy, classism, nativism, ableism, ageism, speciesism, and other forms of inequality mutually reinforce each other to promote systems of oppression. Intersectionality is inseparably linked to an analysis of power relations and structures of subordination, and reveals how individuals and groups relate differently to climate change due to their social position within power structures that are based on contextual dynamics of social categorizations. Only by analyzing the intersection of gender, race, class, and other identities, it is possible to avoid reductionist solutions and pursue climate justice. The literature calls for a systematic understanding of the complexity of different climate change impacts and intersectional inequalities to inform social science climate research so that it can contribute towards intersectional solution to climate change. For Kassier and Kronsel, the hope for a more climate-friendly future lies to some extent in a redefinition of what the good life is all about. However, the models used to design climate and environmental policy are based on normative values and behavioral assumptions related predominantly to white men in Western countries. And political decisions need to be informed by citizens' open discussion based on their lived experience. There is a need to draw on indigenous epistemologies and ecofeminism intersectional work to also include non-human animals, nature, and future generation in the critical analysis to reveal power structure that objectify and instrumentalize nature. And intersectional participatory methods recognize different forms of knowledge that create spaces for listening to the complexity of each other's experiences. Subjective accounts are communicated to the wider group using empathetic approaches to build solidarities and identify common aspects. This delicate process takes place through creative, narrative, visual, and embodied methods, able to reveal the experience that is made invisible by exclusive power structures. These methods recognize conflicts and difficult trade-offs and make them explicit, challenging the politicized win-win narratives. These are methods able to work with the ineradicable tensions between individual and collective identities. As identities are enacted in performances, participatory methods are transforming them, raising important ethical issues. An intersectional perspective in participatory methods will challenge pre-existing labels and social categories, which are central to discriminatory processes, and reframe them collectively. Intersectionality calls for an analysis of the pre-existing social norms against which those labels are appropriated, performed, and attributed. And such methods put at the core self-reflection on power relations and positionality within the group, including the facilitators, and between the group and more powerful actors. They are characterized by collective and constant interrogation on who is and who is not present and why, whose voice is heard and whose experience is recognized, because presence is not the same as voice. And in the proposed intersectional participatory methods, the process of making sense of lived experience takes place through collective critical analysis within the group. Intersectional participatory methodology can make visible intersectional inequalities and biases in policy, challenging assumption on social categories. They can support consciousness raising, strengthen the presence and voice of marginalized individuals, reveals and address conflicts, support collective visioning, develop capacity, and facilitate active participation in political processes at different scales. An intersectional approach to climate change helps move away from extractive knowledge creation and towards politicized co-production approaches that are able to challenge power structures. And I suggest adapting a wide range of methods, including visual, narrative, and artistic, with a focus on ethics and justice. And in particular, in this presentation, I want to focus on storytelling as participatory action research. Participatory action research seeks to transform power relations by challenging conventional processes of knowledge production and acknowledging the importance of the perspective of co-researchers in understanding their reality and acting. And storytelling can be used as participatory action research in a process that allows participants to reframe their own stories and stories told about them individually and collectively. Individuals intentionally build their identity through the assignments of meaning to experiences, generating a story of self mediated by internal and external factors. For Sabin, this process creates opportunities for transformation and improvements. Deep injustices are embodied within people, and storytelling can make these experiences visible to oneself and to others. Storytelling is an intersubjective activity that brings the social into being. This means that listening to someone's story can shift how we see them and change our relationship. Storytelling as a methodology is uniquely positioned to reflect intersectionality and the complexity of lived experiences because it allows for an integrated expression of such experiences through a story. The storytelling approach proposed focuses on the personal dimension of change as a starting point, to link it to wider power structures through a collective process. This is particularly suited because the understanding of the impact of climate change at the individual level can be collectively analyzed to reveal power structures that impact on the group. It is also important for identifying climate solution where action is about personal and structural transformation. And this aspect is especially important as participatory action research has often been criticized for its inability to tackle or even that it ignores wider structural issues with its narrow focus on localized issues and solutions. But the ambition here is to take the potential of power beyond the local by transforming methodologies to deal with the global issue of climate change, by grounding climate change in the complexity of the local experiences of diverse individuals and groups. And personal and collective storytelling offers an entry point for individuals' normative assumptions about justice. It allows the negotiation and transformation of these values because stories shift our understanding of ourselves, of the group, and of the wider society. And such changes take place through relational learning and the challenging of assumptions about ourselves, others, and how we relate to society. Therefore, storytelling can play a key role in the co-production of social norms for a just climate transition. And the process involves iterations between versions of stories and modes of expression, such as sculpting, drawing, drama, creative writing, dance, music, silence, that allows people to process and articulate significant moments in their lives. The debate on principles and social norms is then prompted via the veil of ignorance designed by roles, and in which participants will derive principles and social norms as if they were ignoring their social position, including geography, gender, race, class, ability, sexuality, but drawing on their understanding of intersectional climate inequalities based on their learning from other stories. Crucially to climate justice, they will also ignore when they were born. This thought exercise aids the imagining of an intersectional climate justice future. And for roles, this exercise leads to identifying the principle of a fair society, because no one would want to find themselves in a very bad place should they come into this world in the most disadvantaged position. And throughout the research, art and performative methods are used to consider the perspectives beyond living humans, to include other animals, the planet, and future generations. And imaginative creative processes displays, or at least challenge, the normalized anthropological lens that we all have. And I believe that such intersectional participatory methods could provide what climate scientists need and offer a scalable approach that can continue providing knowledge to the scientific and policy communities based on the lived experience of affected citizens.